Welcome to Lord Nightmare channel. We share scary stories with rainy ambience. I hope this video helps you in some way to sleep, relax, or just be entertained for a while. If you enjoy it, please think about subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button to help my channel out. Now let's begin.
Back when I was in college, Thanksgiving was always something I looked forward to, seeing family, eating way too much food, and just escaping the stress of school for a few days. That year was no different. We were gathering at my grandparents' house, and it was shaping up to be the usual cozy family holiday. The day before Thanksgiving, I decided to run a few errands before heading home. My mom asked if I could pick up a few groceries on the way back, so I stopped at a local supermarket around 6 p.m. It was packed, no surprise, considering everyone was stocking up for the holiday. I had to park near the far end of the lot and walk across the cold, dimly lit expanse to get inside. The store was chaotic. Carts were bumping into each other, kids were crying, and people were rushing up and down the aisles like it was a race. I was focused on my list, trying to grab the few items I needed as quickly as possible. That's when I noticed her. She was standing near the frozen food section, a woman in her late 30s or early 40s, with stringy hair and an oversized coat. What caught my attention wasn't her appearance, it was her eyes. She was staring at me, not in a casual way, but with an intense, unblinking focus that made my skin crawl. I glanced away, thinking maybe she was looking at something behind me, but when I turned back, her eyes were still locked on me. I moved to another aisle, feeling uneasy but brushing it off as just a strange encounter. A few minutes later, as I was grabbing some canned goods, I spotted her again. This time, she was standing at the end of the aisle, half hidden behind a display of chips, still staring. My heart started to race. She wasn't shopping. She didn't have a cart or even a basket. She was just there, watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. The store was packed after all. Maybe it was a coincidence. But every time I moved to another part of the store, she appeared, always keeping a distance but never breaking eye contact. By the time I got to the checkout line, I was on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see her anymore. Relieved, I quickly paid for my items and headed out to the parking lot. The cold night air hit me as I walked back to my car, the bags in my hands swinging slightly with each step. The parking lot was mostly empty now, the rows of cars casting long, eerie shadows under the flickering lights. As I reached my car and unlocked it, I felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I glanced around but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off the feeling, I loaded the groceries into the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Then came the knock. It was sudden and sharp, right at the passenger side window. I jumped, my heart pounding as I turned to see her, the woman from the store. She was standing there, her face partially obscured by her hood, her eyes wide and fixed on me. She held up a $20 bill, motioning for me to roll down the window. "You dropped this," she said, her voice muffled by the glass. I frowned, confused. I hadn't even touched my wallet in the parking lot. "I'm pretty sure it's not mine," I said, my voice shaky. Her expression didn't change. She nodded insistently and tapped the window again, pushing the bill closer to the glass. Against my better judgment, I cracked the window just enough to speak. "Really, it's not mine," I repeated. Her hand shot through the gap, trying to grab the lock. Panicking, I rolled the window up, but she didn't back away. Instead, she pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging it up as she muttered something I couldn't understand. And then she started crawling. I froze as she began to hoist herself onto the car, her hands gripping the edge of the partially open window. Her movements were unnatural, almost inhuman, as she twisted and contorted her body to squeeze inside. Adrenaline kicked in. I yanked the keys from the ignition, shoved the door open, and bolted. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the lot. Turning back, I saw her sitting in the driver's seat, her head tilted at an odd angle as she stared at me through the windshield. I pulled out my phone and called the police, my hands trembling as I explained what had happened. While I waited for them to arrive, I stayed hidden behind another car, watching as she rummaged through mine. Minutes later, the woman got out, clutching something in her hands. I squinted to see what it was, a small slip of paper. She held it up to her face, staring at it for a moment before dropping it onto the ground and walking away, disappearing into the shadows. When the police arrived, I showed them the paper. It was a receipt from the store with the words, "See you soon," scrawled in shaky handwriting on the back. I didn't sleep that night, and even though I never saw her again, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watching me for much longer than I realized. Thanksgiving at my grandparents' farm had always been the same. Warm food, polite conversations, and the distant hum of old family stories I had no interest in. This year, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the chill of the evening crept in, I decided I needed a break. After all, I was 17 and desperate for a little adventure, not another round of pie and adult small talk. "I'm going for a walk," I announced, grabbing my jacket and stepping into the brisk evening air before anyone could object. The farm stretched endlessly, but my feet instinctively took me toward the barn. The structure loomed in the shadows, its weathered boards groaning faintly in the wind. It had been years since anyone used the barn for anything other than storage. As I approached, I noticed the barn door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if beckoning me inside. Pushing it open, I was greeted by a rush of musty air. The darkness inside was thick and impenetrable, so I pulled out my phone and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a clutter of forgotten tools, old farming equipment, and thick cobwebs that hung like ghosts from the rafters. A faint creak echoed above me, but I brushed it off as the wind. I was starting to enjoy the eerie solitude when something on the workbench caught my eye, a hatchet. Its blade was rusted, but the dried brown streaks on the edge stopped me cold. Blood? The thought flickered through my mind, but I reasoned it must be from the days when my grandparents raised livestock. Still, the sight sent a shiver crawling down my spine. Trying to shake the unease, I ventured further, climbing the creaky wooden stairs to the loft. My phone's light danced across mounds of old hay, casting long, shifting shadows. At first, it seemed like there was nothing of interest up there, just decades of forgotten farm life. But then, my foot struck something solid beneath the hay. Curious, I nudged the hay aside with my shoe and froze. A face stared back at me, or more accurately, the hollow eye sockets of a skull. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, the phone shaking in my hand as the light revealed the rest of the decayed remains. A skeletal body curled unnaturally, clothes tattered and clinging to yellowed bones. A sudden noise snapped me out of my paralysis. It was faint, a dragging sound, coming from below the loft. My mind raced. Was someone there? I scrambled back toward the stairs, my heart pounding like a drum. The noise grew louder, and the barn felt alive with shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The dragging stopped. Summoning courage I didn't know I had, I peeked over the edge of the loft. The flashlight beam quivered as it landed on the barn floor. At first, there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. But then, in the far corner, I saw movement. A figure, small and impossibly hunched, emerged from the darkness, its outline grotesque. Its head tilted unnaturally, and for a moment, I swore it was looking directly at me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Bolting down the stairs, I tore through the barn door and sprinted back to the house, nearly collapsing as I burst into the kitchen. My words tumbled over each other as I tried to explain what I'd found. My parents and uncle exchanged glances before arming themselves with flashlights and heading out to the barn. When they returned, their faces were pale. My dad's voice was low and grim as he said, "We found the body. But there's nothing else out there." The sheriff arrived within the hour, and an investigation began. The body was old, decomposed, and riddled with wounds that matched the hatchet I had touched. But there was no sign of the figure I'd seen. The barn was empty, or so they said. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow sockets and heard that dragging sound. To this day, the mystery of the body remains unsolved. And as for the figure in the barn, I pray it was just my imagination. Thanksgiving at our house was always a grand event, filled with warmth, laughter, and the familiar chaos of family. My wife and I hosted every year, and it was a tradition we both cherished. Last year, things went a bit differently. In fact, it's a night I still struggle to understand. The first guests started arriving in the early afternoon, as usual. Our parents, siblings, and aunts and uncles filled the house, their chatter and laughter bouncing off the walls. It wasn't long before the place felt alive with the holiday spirit. I was running back and forth from the kitchen, helping my wife with the final touches on the feast. When I stepped out into the living room, the sight of everyone mingling brought a smile to my face. But then I saw him. Standing in the far corner of the room, near the staircase, was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in a faded brown coat that looked far too worn for the occasion. He wasn't interacting with anyone, just standing there, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. At first, I thought he might be a plus one that someone brought along without mentioning. But something about him felt off. I walked over to my uncle, who was chatting with my dad nearby, and asked, "Hey, who's that guy over there?" My uncle glanced toward the man and said, "Oh, he came in right behind us. Said he's a good friend of yours. Figured you invited him." "I don't know him," I replied, my voice dropping. Alarm bells were already going off in my head. I decided to approach the man, but as soon as I took a step in his direction, he turned his head sharply toward me. Our eyes met, and for a split second, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Without a word, he started moving, not toward the front door, but up the stairs. I hurried after him, but he was quick. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, he had disappeared. All the doors up there were closed, just as they had been earlier. I called out, "Hey, you can't be up here." Silence. I checked the guest bedroom first. Empty. Then I moved to the bathroom. Nothing. Finally, I reached the door to our bedroom. It was locked. My stomach dropped. We never locked that door. "Hey, come out of there," I shouted, pounding on the door. No answer. The air upstairs felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I leaned in closer, trying to hear any movement on the other side of the door, but there was nothing, just an eerie, unsettling stillness. I hurried back downstairs and told my wife what was happening. Her face paled, and she quickly got our parents and siblings involved. Everyone was equally baffled and uneasy. After some debate, we decided to call the police. We had no idea who this man was or what his intentions might be, and none of us felt safe confronting him alone. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. The festive mood was gone, replaced by a tense, nervous energy. When the officers arrived, they went straight upstairs. I followed them, staying a few steps behind. One officer knocked on the locked door, identifying himself and ordering the man to come out. No response. They forced the door open. The bedroom was empty. The window was latched from the inside, and there was no other way out. The officers searched every inch of the room and the rest of the house, but there was no sign of the man. He was simply gone. The police didn't have an explanation. They suggested he might have slipped out of the house unnoticed before locking the door behind him, but that didn't sit right with me. I knew what I'd seen, and the locked door made no sense. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was eerily quiet, my wife and I found something that still haunts me. On the pillow of our bed was a single photograph. It was old and faded, showing a family standing in front of a house that looked eerily similar to ours. But the most chilling part was the man standing at the edge of the group. It was him. We've hosted Thanksgiving every year since we moved into this house, but this year, we decided to go somewhere else. I'm not sure who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm not taking any chances with him coming back. It was last Thanksgiving when my family decided to break from tradition and spend the holiday at my grandparents' old cabin. The cabin was deep in the woods, isolated from the noise of the city. We thought it would be a refreshing change, a chance to disconnect, bond, and enjoy the snowy scenery. But looking back, I wish we had never gone. The drive up there was treacherous. A surprise snowstorm hit midway through our trip, blanketing the winding roads in thick layers of ice and snow. By the time we arrived, the sun had set and the cabin was cloaked in darkness. We unloaded the car quickly, eager to get inside and warm up. My dad started a fire in the old stone fireplace while my mom heated up some leftovers. My siblings and I set up candles around the cabin, casting long, flickering shadows across the creaky wooden walls. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wounded animal. By the next morning, the snowstorm hadn't let up. The forecast had underestimated its intensity, and we were effectively trapped. The roads were completely impassable. It was frustrating, but we decided to make the best of it. We played board games, shared stories, and laughed as the storm continued to rage. Yet, as night fell again, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The storm seemed too intense, too relentless. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind, and the shadows cast by the firelight felt unnervingly alive. That's when the noises started. It was subtle at first, a faint thud against the cabin wall that could have been dismissed as snow falling from the roof. But then came the scraping. It sounded deliberate, like something sharp being dragged across the wooden exterior. My mom reassured us it was probably just a branch scratching against the cabin, but her voice betrayed her nervousness. As the hours dragged on, the sounds grew louder, more insistent. Around midnight, I was lying in my sleeping bag near the fireplace when a deafening bang echoed through the cabin. It sounded like someone, or something, was pounding on the back door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Everyone else had gone to bed, but I could hear the creak of the floorboards above as my parents stirred. Gathering my courage, I crept toward the back door. The window next to it was frosted over, but I could just make out a dark figure standing outside. They weren't moving, just standing there, like they were waiting for something. My heart raced as I backed away, bumping into my dad, who had come down the stairs with a flashlight and a heavy wrench in hand. We locked eyes, and without a word, he motioned for me to stay back. He approached the door cautiously, peering out through the frosted glass. The figure was still there, but now they were holding something, a long, jagged piece of wood. My mom appeared behind us, clutching her phone as she dialed 911. Suddenly, the pounding resumed, harder this time. The door frame shuddered under the force, and I could see splinters beginning to crack near the lock. My dad yelled for whoever it was to leave, but the pounding only grew more frantic. The scraping sound returned, this time along the side of the cabin, like there was more than one person out there. The operator assured my mom that police were on their way, but with the storm, it would take time. My dad moved a heavy cabinet in front of the door, and we huddled together near the fireplace, the banging and scraping echoing around us. At one point, the sound shifted to the windows, and I thought I saw a face pressed against the glass, pale, gaunt, and utterly devoid of emotion. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. We sat there, barely daring to breathe, until the red and blue lights of a police car flashed through the windows. 2 officers braved the storm to reach us, their presence a much-needed relief. The police inspected the property and found footprints in the snow circling the cabin. They also discovered deep gouges in the walls and the back door nearly broken through. Strangely, the footprints led into the woods but didn't come back out. The officers searched as much as they could but found no sign of anyone. What's more, they discovered that our power lines had been intentionally cut, a detail that sent chills down my spine. The storm cleared by morning, and we wasted no time packing up and leaving. My dad hired a crew to retrieve anything we left behind, and we never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside that night, but sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I'm reminded of the pounding on that cabin door and the face in the window. I don't think I'll ever forget it.